Hello, everybody. Welcome to the show. This is Jul of the Inner Resilience Network. So happy you're here to join us. And I'm really happy that my friend Rob Wipond is here to join us today and discussing the topic of mental health. And we'll talk about that very terminology, mental health itself, and his new book. And we're going to go into talking about solutions for how we can grapple with today's overwhelming problem in the society everywhere of mental health issues, mental, emotional, spiritual health issues that probably people out there are dealing with. I know a lot going on out there. So I'm really excited about this conversation with you, Rob, and I'm really happy to introduce you. We've been working together for a while, but this is the first time we actually get to sit down and really get into this conversation. So without further ado, let me introduce my dear friend. Rob he's a freelance journalist, and he's also a creative nonfiction writer who writes frequently about the interface between psychiatry, civil rights, community issues, policing, surveillance, and privacy, and also a lot about social change. His articles have been nominated for 17 magazine and journalism awards in science, law, business, and community issues. And last but not least, he is just came out with a new book. Really exciting. I'm really looking forward to reading it. It's called Your Consent is Not Required: The Rise in Psychiatric Detentions, Forced Treatment, and Abusive Guardianships. Now, I know that's a pretty intense title, and I'm looking forward to hearing you unpack it a little bit, Rob. And then we're going to go into what we can do about it. So without further ado, let's pass it on over to you, Rob, and tell us a little bit about how you even got into this field of mental health and of this subject in particular that we're going to be talking about.
All right, thanks a lot. It's great to have this chance to talk with you in this way about the both the book and the work and the connections between our different types of work and some of the work we have in common. So yeah, I mean, I always had an interest in the inner world ever since I was a kid. I took up meditation when I was like in high school. I read books about inner exploration and discovery and things. So I always had that kind of interest, and I kind of heard about the mental health system on the periphery. I read a few books about people's experiences in psychiatric hospitals, things like that. And so I had this sort of critical notion of, well, I don't really like that, and I'm more into spiritual views of life and reality and things like that. And then really a big turning point, as I describe in the book in the introduction, is my family's experience. So my father, career college professor of computer engineering, was going through a difficult period after a cancer diagnosis, shortly after retirement, and he sought help at a psychiatric hospital, at a general hospital. Actually, went to the emergency ward, and was promptly labeled as seriously mentally ill, locked up, began to be forcibly treated. None of the drugs were working. They just seemed to be making him worse. He had multiple drugs all at once. And then they proceeded to propose electroconvulsive shock therapy. And just it turned into this really brutal experience for him, humiliating and brutal, and really for the whole family, quite shocking and distressing to go through over the course of the next 9 months. And so, I mean, the repercussions were huge. He lost a lot of memory. Some of it did come back, but not all of it. And yeah, it was just really hard. And so I immediately did start to wonder, wow, who else is this happening to? If this can happen to my father, educated, white, middle class person with all the family supports you'd want and all that, and he could suddenly lose all his rights and freedoms like so quickly and easily, I started to wonder, who else is this happening to and what's happening to them? And so that began the process of sort of researching, finding, talking to other people who'd gone through similar experiences, and then looking at the science, the economics, and so on.
Wow, that's a big, that's huge to go through that. And I hope your father's okay now. He's come through it.
Well, to some degree, I don't know that he's ever really recovered fully from it emotionally. It's hard to tease that out now from other things that have happened late in life. He's 92 now. So,
Hmm.
affected by a lot of other things, physically and mentally, emotionally, the loss of my mother and so forth. But yeah, to some degree, even though he doesn't have memory of that year, that's one of the things that have never come back. He's only got a few spotty memories of the year around when the electroshocks happened. It still left him with this very distressing memory, because when he kind of pieced it together in conversations with others and realized what he'd lost, it was really hard for him, right? It created a lot of fear then of ever reaching out again when he needed help. He was already a very private person, and now even more so.
Wow, it's so it must be so incredibly um I almost want to say debilitating to have an experience where you're reaching out for help and have that help be the very thing that hurts you the most. And I'm blown away that they're still doing electroshock, by the way. That's just wow. That seems so barbaric. Like, what are we doing? What are we doing? So why is this happening? Do you have any sense of that? Like, so give us the landscape of kind of the mental health system in general, and what's happening in there, what's working, what's not working. I mean, obviously we
So there's a dominant narrative out there, and let me be very clear. I'm talking about people who are resisting. So, of course, there's a vast numbers of people out there who voluntarily seek help, and they can afford it. They can hire their own therapist or something. They get into counseling. They try a psychiatric medication. They find that, hey, this does sort of make me feel better. They stay on it. I'm not talking about those people. This book is about the people who say, this drug does not help me. That therapy is not helping me. I do not want it. I find it's making me worse in some way. And then what happens to them? And the dominant narrative out there we have to address is that since the 1950s, we closed all of these large asylums where a lot of people with labeled with mental illnesses were being held. And as a result of the closure of these asylums, we have very few beds today. Hardly anyone's ever getting forcibly treated. Nobody has long-term places to stay, and so on and so forth. This is the dominant narrative out there. And now it's even being blamed for mass homelessness. So in California, New York, and a lot of these large cities, urban centers, where there's massive amounts of homelessness as a result of poor housing affordability, that's now being blamed on mental illness and blamed on the closure of these asylums. So what I found is both of these, all of this whole narrative is actually wrong. It's just been heavily promoted, and that's a story in and of itself. But the narrative is just fundamentally false. So what we do know is that as they closed those large asylums, lots of other types of psychiatric institutions were created, and psychiatric beds within other types of institutions. So there are private hospitals, general hospitals, psychiatric wards, nursing homes have specialized psychiatric beds, assisted living, group homes, all of these places. And when you add them all up, you find that we actually have more beds per capita than we had back in the 1950s. So that's a really important context for what I say next, which is that I also found that wherever we find data, and I have to say it's very hard to get any of this data, there's a lot of giant black hole of the mental health system. But wherever we can find decent data, we found that psychiatric detentions are going up and up and up, and have been for decades. And we're arguably, although it's hard to compare back to the 1950s, because back then people were locked up for years at a time, certainly detentions today are more likely to be days, weeks, months long rather than years. But in any case, the numbers overall are really high and going up a lot. It seems like many more people have been subjected to this experience today than had ever experienced it back in the 1950s. That's kind of, I think, the good best way of looking at it. Far more people in the population overall per capita. The rates have clearly increased a lot, that more people have had these kinds of experiences, even though they tend to be shorter term. So
which
that's the system.
which population, Rob? I mean, what areas are we talking about? What countries? Um,
So I'm talking about the United States and Canada. We find that the rates in the US and Canada are roughly comparable, but ours are much higher than comparable Western countries. So as soon as you're off the map of some of the richer countries that have developed mental health systems in the way we've developed them, you've got a whole different set of things you have to look at to make comparisons. So it's harder in poorer countries and things like that. But
Have you?
within Western European countries where the systems are very comparable and the overall standard of living is comparable, we're
Uh,
seeing that our rates are much higher, like
okay,
double or triple the rates in Western Europe.
okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, I am curious about the other countries, and South America, Central America, Asia. You have any sense of that? Just a kind of broad brush.
So it gets harder because in a lot of these countries, and I have to say I haven't studied a lot of them in depth because my interest really was in the contemporary situation in North America, because you need a focus for something like this. But I would say generally from what I've seen, talked about, observed in looking at what's happening internationally is sometimes these systems are even more abusive in other countries because there aren't well-funded healthcare systems overall. So consequently, people are just being locked up, chained up, in really abusive kind of conditions overall. Even though I want to, we'll talk about how this plays out in North America. It's not pretty either, but it can clearly be because of the poverty conditions of the institutions themselves and of the society as a whole. It can often be, very, very bad. And you're getting a much more confusing mix of who's being locked up and for what reasons, because much like in the 1950s we did in North America, the criminals were mixed in with people being labeled with these illnesses, mixed in with people with actual physical conditions that were diagnosable, but they were otherwise not curable and things like that. So it gets really kind of muddy. I will say this, though, we have some good examples in South America right now going on. In Mexico and Brazil have been visiting the question of involuntary treatment overall and are actually moving away from it faster than we are here in North America. We're doing more and more of it rather than less, whereas there has been some international effort as a result of the World Health Organization and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities to actually reduce involuntary treatment. And other countries are picking up that mantle better than we are here in North America.
That's okay. Thank you for that. Yeah, and the WHO, the World Health Organization, which actually coined the term mental health, right, back in the early 1900s, oversees the mental health. I don't know, for want of a better word, industry
Yeah.
system.
I,
Um,
I don't know that I don't know the history of that term mental health. That's interesting. But in any case, the World Health Organization unfortunately doesn't have a lot of power. They have some influence. So what's happened there is because of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was a very robust international consultation process. And within that convention now, it's been clearly articulated that forcibly confining someone on the basis of a disability, in this case being labeled with a psychiatric disorder, that this is improper under the convention, and forcibly treating them under that is also improper under the convention. So the World Health Organization has furthered that, and they've issued a number of reports on how countries can reduce involuntary treatment in their societies, and guidance on legislation most recently too, and how to change the mental health laws to accommodate a non-coercive approach.
yeah, okay. Yeah, well, what you're talking about in your book and what you're highlighting here, forced detentions, forced treatment. It sounds to me, as horrible as that is, and as many repercussions as that has, it still sounds to me like it's a symptom of something even more. How do we talk about what is the cause of this? Is it this top-down thinking of I don't know, pathologizing somebody being different? It's starting there, or is it something bigger and more legitimate than just saying that?
So what I found in the book, in the course of researching my book, was that these mental health laws have broadened a lot. So it's no longer only if you're quote unquote a danger to self or others, but now they have criteria in there about if you might experience mental or physical deterioration in some way in the future. then you can be detained, forcibly treated. So these laws are broadened in most jurisdictions. So that's what's fueling this. And what I also found was that it's a very broad spectrum of societies being affected. These laws are being used in many, many different kinds of circumstances against many different kinds of people. And so consequently, there's many different motivations that are driving it. And in a general sense, I'd say, yes, you're right. Like there are things that are happening in society right now where people are experiencing increasing distress, I think. And that is one of the fuels of it, so that they're seeking help, they're looking for help. The mental health system is definitely, its in funding has increased, its exposure to the general population has increased. And so people like my father are reaching out for help, and they're getting kind of drawn into the system. And often they're quite shocked to discover how easily within that system they can lose their rights as soon as they start resisting something that's being recommended for them. And so that's part of it. So there is a goodwill intention that drives it. We're trying to help people, but I also found lots of questionable intentions going on. Mass scale fraud. There's a lot of money making that could be made off of people because you're essentially a prisoner, and then they can bilk insurance, health insurance, for much higher rates than you can, get from the government for actual ordinary prisoners. So we have that going on. We have it being used in nursing homes to control people who may have dementia or otherwise, may be speaking out and rebelling in some way and disliking the treatment that they're getting. And these antipsychotic drugs are used there and forced on these people to control their behaviors. I found schools using it as a method of management of disruptive or distressed students. So it's very common now. We have really good data on this in certain states like New York and Florida, where it's astronomical, really, like how much teachers in the classrooms are calling 911 and getting their students taken up to psychiatric hospitals against their will. And really terrible things can happen as a result of this, where parents get cut out of the loop. So that's one of the main things I look at in the book, is what institutions are using mental health laws as management tools right now. And there's a
Yes. Yes, that's really important point. In fact, I want to highlight and take a moment here and highlight to anybody listening that if somebody out there is having a psychotic break, or what you consider to be a psychotic break, they're just behaving abnormally, don't call the police unless, of course, they're violent, or that you're at risk, at clear risk from their behavior. But if it's just them going off, don't call the police, because then the police are not trained to deal with mental health issues, people that are having these kinds of behaviors necessarily, and they're going to deal with them in a criminal way, and they're going to be brought into that system, and it's horrendous, the stories I've heard. So I just want to make a shout out to everybody that if there is this uh organization that's kind of like a mutual aid started organization called Cahoots. And I think there's probably other ones that have followed suit, that are trained therapists, trained professionals that are you call them and they go and they deal, and they kind of like, bring that person down if they can. They do what they need to do to help them, from from a mental health professional standpoint, and not a police or a criminal standpoint. So that's some kind of intervention, but we need a lot more of that in this system. And clearly, this is a big, big problem that you're talking about and that you're exposing. And it's really important that you're showing what's going on, because I think people don't realize that this is going on unless they're witnessing it in their own circles or family, like you did. Um,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, it's very hidden. It's very hard to get data. It's very hard to get studies. We're just kind of given this story. Often it'll just be a psychiatrist, a mental health professional, administrator quoted saying, "Oh, it's unfortunate that we have to do it sometimes, but it all works out in the end." And what I found is it often does not, and in fact, it looks like maybe in the majority of cases it does not. The science in this area is very poor. There's been almost no formal studying of the outcomes of involuntary treatment. as one researcher said, it's based on tradition more than evidence. We've just been forcibly treating people for a really long time. But we don't have the evidence to back up that it's helping people. We have a lot of anecdotal stories of it really harming and traumatizing people, because what we're talking about is incarceration, loss of freedoms, restraints to gurneys, forced injections of powerful tranquilizing drugs, sometimes for prolonged periods of time. It can forced stripping is sometimes involved in this, so it can be really re-traumatizing for people who've had experiences of disempowerment, or, in their lives of that kind, where
Mhm.
people were assaulting them physically in some way, things like that. So yeah, it's a really brutal thing going on out there, and I need to emphasize that unfortunately, mental health professionals are part of this problem. So yes, in a lot of cases, we don't want police responding because they're armed and people get shot in this, and that happens a terrible amount of times during wellness checks when people were just calling, trying to get somebody help, and the police came and really caused problems. But unfortunately, a lot of people told me, hey, you know what? The police were actually the nicest people in my experience. They came, they were polite. They said, yeah, really sorry, we have to do this. We're going to take you out for an evaluation. And then things went off a rail at the hospitals, because these mental health professionals are often trained and required. They're just looking for certain cues and flags and what people say to implement these laws. And really, and that's what I like to highlight to people, that actually the police are beholden to the mental health professionals, not vice versa. The way the
Right.
legislation is written, mental health professionals contact police and say, go arrest this person. It doesn't happen in reverse. The police cannot call up a mental health person. They can bring someone in, but the mental health professionals say, sorry, yeah, I don't agree with you, and let them go again. It's the mental health professionals who have the absolute control
Okay.
under these laws.
Well,
Yeah.
thanks for clarifying that. Yeah, I wish there were more interventions like Cahoots, because I think they're very sensitive to the problems of the system, so
Yeah, yeah, to
so
highlight that. There
so
are
that
others.
that's
Yeah.
really that's the solution based work that is going on out there, and I feel like we need more of that. It's a grassroots mutual aid based, and I also think it's important to differentiate with the mental health therapists the professionals that you're talking about, because I mean, largely what you're exposing is kind of the world in psychiatry, right? And psychiatric institutions. Then there's also the mental health professionals that are your private therapists. You have money, you can pay them. Yes, that's a different category, isn't it? I mean, do we need to differentiate mental health professionals in that way?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important part of the discussion for sure. So currently, mental health laws have given medical professionals, physicians and psychiatrists, absolute authority. And so I've communicated with many psychologists and therapists who of different kinds who have been on staff at institutions and have been very frustrated because they don't think someone needs to be treated in this way, and they have their own professional opinion and approach that they'd like to try, and they're often overridden by the psychiatrist or the physician on staff. So yeah, that's an issue. We're also seeing in society, though, at the same time, a growing together of these in the mainstream. So it's not uncommon at all now for, say, a school mental health education program to kind of start with that broader base of, like, a kind of counseling approach, a sort of therapeutic approach, talk with your friends, help each other, and start with that approach, but then you proceed through the curriculum to day 3 or whatever, and suddenly they're saying, but if you aren't, like, miraculously and completely cured within 2 weeks, you may, have a serious mental disorder, and you better see a psychiatrist ASAP. And they're kind of inculcated with this sort of fear of their own experiences. So we're seeing that right now, and I kind of wish, like 20 years ago, when I was kind of doing this research, when I was beginning, it was much easier to get psychologists, their non-medical staff on the phone, and have them speak out about these issues themselves, speak out critically about forced treatment. That's much harder to do today. So we're seeing a kind of shift happening here across the culture right now that we need to identify as well. But
Okay.
I want to give a shout out to these other programs. And with that, to highlight that 988 is not one of them. So 988, for example, right now, it's being promoted, and they will contact police. They will trace calls and contact police and have you taken in into a psychiatric hospital against your will. Whereas there are warm lines out there, often peer run, and I think Cahoots is one of those, right? That I don't know a lot about it, but I think it's peer run. So people who have experienced these things before and decided we're not going to do that. We're just going to talk with you no matter what, and there are other warm lines like that out there.
Yeah.
Samaritan runs one out of New York. Wildflower Alliance runs one out of Massachusetts, where you can call and they make a policy of we will never contact police against your will, no matter what you say on this call. And I think we need a lot more of that.
Great. Could you say that number again? That's the good one, the warm one?
So Samaritans in New York currently still have that policy. Not all Samaritans, unfortunately. This is another shift we've seen in the last decade. So a lot of the Samaritans used to have a policy of never call tracing, but as they joined the 988 National Suicide Prevention Lifeline,
Mhm.
they've been forced to actually implement these forced intervention procedures. So Samaritans in New York has stayed out of it. They've had a policy and they're still sticking to it. So
Okay.
I want to support them too because they need funding.
Okay.
Yeah, and then it's called Wildflower Alliance out of
Yeah.
Massachusetts. So you can find them in your local community. Just ask, right? Point up, ask, say, are there conditions under which you might contact police during this call or contact 911 to trace my call because I want to know that, and under what conditions would you? And usually you'll get, eventually, if you keep at it, get an honest answer from them.
Great. That's really important, especially and we're going to kind of shift over into just talking about more about what we can do in response to this and kind of the wider problem, which let's see if I can name it. It sounds like, there's been this behemoth of a top-down control system on what we're calling mental health. And now and there has been slowly built a framework around mental health that has lent itself towards stigmatizing labeling somebody that's having a mental health problem, and so that's exacerbated the whole problem. And so that's something. And then we've got on top of that, we've got people that are not don't have the privilege of being able to hire private therapists and so on, or find resources in their community. So they reach out to the system, and then maybe they're having a temporary thing, but then that temporary thing becomes a longer term thing because trauma is real, and uh, you can get caught in a trauma loop and have trauma responses, and then it just you get in this what I call the spin cycle. So so we've got that. I don't know if that kind of encompasses. That definitely probably doesn't encompass everything. I'm not even going to touch on the pharmaceutical companies, which are a huge big part of it, and I'm sure that their hands in the mix have been directing a lot of this. But I know we could easily go down that rabbit hole, but we'll save that for another time because that's a whole conversation in itself. But I'd like to just go into, you know, so we've kind of had this broad brush of what's wrong, and you have exposed something that is really, really, really scary that most people don't know about, that we need to see. In order to solve something in society, we can't solve it unless we first see it. We have to uncover it. We have to face it. It's the collective shadow, right? This is part of our collective shadow. What you were talking about. Your book is exposing the shadow. So kudos to you. This is just so important. And it's not easy to talk about. It's not easy to hear about. It's much easier to just kind of look the other way, go, oh, and make up reasons why that isn't important. But it's a symptom of the wider uh Wetiko, the collective shadow.
Yeah.
So we're naming this problem. Let's talk a little bit. Let's kind of move into how we can begin as you and me and as our community begin to address in whatever way we can, because you and I are both very active in what we call the transition movement. And I'll just give for people out there what a little synopsis of what that is. Transition is it is a movement. It is kind of an organized movement, but it's also a very very eclectic, unorganized movement as well, because it's simply people in their communities trying to help the community become more locally resilient and resourceful. In other words, growing their own food, finding local energy, ways to reconnect with the earth, reconnect with their communities in a way that they can become resilient and thriving and not dependent on the corporate consumer top-down model that we've all been handed, you know. So communities everywhere around the world are seeing that this is the way out, and they're trying their best to find ways to do that. And the transition movement is it emerged in the early 2000s as an answer to try to, you know, kind of bring people together as an answer to the problems that we are seeing in the world. So you and I are both very involved in the transition movement. You live in Canada, me in the US, and internationally. And so let's just say a little bit about you know, that approach, which is very solution oriented. You know, we're very practical, we're very hands-on, we're very nuts and bolts, like what works, what doesn't, which is also very mutual aid oriented, which I already mentioned that term. Mutual aid is just people out there just rolling up their sleeves and just getting to it, you know, they're just doing it. They're not waiting for some authority to tell them it's okay, you know. So that's what I love about the transition movement. And I really think that it is the answer. Personally, I still, after all these years, even though there's a lot of trouble, you know, because we're human, right? I still think that this is the way to go if we're going to have a chance as humanity on this planet. So, how do we bring the transition mindset and heart set to this very uh, challenging problem that you're exposing, this shadow? So,
Well, yeah, I think there's a number of ways at that. And one is, I think if we just also hone in again exactly on what you asked me at the beginning of this conversation, which was the intentions behind why it's happening the way it's happening, because then I think that opens the doorway to what are the solutions. So what we have, the dominant intentions as stated by the public right now, as believed by legislators, is that on sort of, if you might say, somewhat on the political left, it's a helping intention. We have forced treatment, we support forced treatment because we're trying to help people who really need help. And then on somewhat on the right, the tendency is a little more to frame it as a policing intention. These people are dangerous. You know, they might still bring in that helping mode from, but it's also more like we want to control these people. So with those two things, right, that's where we can start. We can go, okay, how about we do neither of those things? Because they both involve taking away people's fundamental rights. And is that really a good place to start? How about we start from a true helping intention, which is to say, okay, we're seeing somebody who maybe really is in distress. Maybe they are really having troubles. Maybe they really are struggling. Fair enough. We can see that. Maybe they're affirming that to us as well when we really ask them. We develop enough of a rapport for them to be honest with us. And so now we ask them. We say, well, what would help you? You know, we're seeing you out here on the street, or we're seeing you here suffering such anxiety that you can't go to work, or you can't get to school, or that you're so depressed about the state of the world that now you don't even want to get out of bed. We see that, and what would truly help you? What would make you feel better? And so you open up this whole thing. And you know, originally you and I came to connection through this, right? Where I was noticing that the opposite was happening, that in fact, right now, in a lot of sort of the activities that are about community development, neighbor connections, we're seeing the mental health system step in there and kind of go, you're having a mental health problem. Let us help you with mental health solutions. And so that's why I kind of think the terminology has become problematic. You know, I want to get rid of that and go, what are we really talking about here when we talk about somebody, just because is it really a mental health problem, or is it this person's depressed because the world really is a very depressing place in many ways. And when somebody's in that state, they can just really be resonating with, yeah, this is it. I'm looking at suffering, I'm looking at war, I'm looking at poverty, I'm seeing these things, I'm looking at climate change, and I feel depressed, or I might feel anxious, or it might plunge me into the state where I'm starting to just go, I want to escape, and I start imagining things that aren't real. Like any of these things can happen. And so we want to back up then and go, okay, this isn't a mental health problem that needs drugging. It doesn't even necessarily need therapy in the way we might usually mean that word. Maybe it means connection. It means support. What does support look like for you? What does mutual support look like where we're helping each other? So I think that's where it really begins to resonate with what the transition movement has been trying to do, and what indeed I think all community development, asset-based community development, was intending to do originally, which is to say, what are your strengths? Yes, I see your struggles. What are your strengths? What are your passions? How do you want to change your community? How do you want to change your personal life? And how does that connect to the others around you, right? How they're responding in some ways, how they're feeling. How can you collaborate together to bring about these changes?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And that you know, peer-to-peer counseling is, I know, gotten more and more popular, and there's a variety of forms of that. But that's kind of what comes to my mind when you're talking about that, is like that's, yeah. And especially people that are traumatized by the system itself, that have challenges, mental, emotional challenges, and that get traumatized by the system in addition to that, become super paranoid and skeptical of the system, of any help outside so for them, that's often the only way that they'll accept help, is like from a fellow, a friend or someone they trust. It's not like authority that has some ability to, do anything to them.
Yeah. And we live in such fragmented communities now, most of us, right? Like we're a lot of our social interaction actually just online or through texting and things like that. In-person connections are diminishing in our lives for
Yeah.
many of us anyway. And that, I think, we really need to rebuild it. That is clearly part of people's sense of isolation and distress. And when then they're confronting these big social movements out there that are part of their distress. They're not only poor themselves, they're seeing this mass scale poverty out there, or they're feeling like they're on the edge of that, that they could be poor soon. And so we're all feeling that kind of stress. And then we're
Yeah.
isolated. We don't have a solution for it. It's what really so much is about that. I remember when, many years ago, I lived in a very poor community in South America for a while. And even there, I mean, I'm not saying this is the solution, but it felt so much different than poverty in North America, because there were so many people in that state, and they were just regularly looking for opportunities to help and support emotionally and practically in any way. And it wasn't like implicitly humiliating to be poor, because hey, it happens to all of us. It was happening to so many of us, right? And whereas in North America, I think till today, even though poverty is growing, there's still this sense, I think, for a lot of us, that if you're poor, you've somehow failed. You are a failure. You can quickly get on these downward spirals, right? And so I think really community connection is vital to that. I notice this constantly in the work on the book too. So many people just said to me, wow, you're like the first one who's ever even listened to the whole of my story. And people would
Wow.
find that really uplifting. And similarly, like now these people are reaching out to me to say, thank you for, putting my voice in the book, or putting something like someone representing the kinds of feelings I had. And they're uplifted by it. And I don't think that's an illusion. Of course, it's a small thing in the grand scheme, but I still think it's meaningful. It affects me, it affects them. And I think this is it, right? This is what it means to be in community, that somehow my skill and their skill, my story and their story came together in this way that for both of us has helped us move along a trajectory. And it doesn't have to be money, it doesn't have to be, prestige, it doesn't have to be any of those things. It can just be, wow, I feel understood, and I feel like we're
Yeah.
there for each
Yeah.
other in a new way.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really important because, we are witnessing, social, the social the social fabric fragmenting in many places. And yeah, there are cultures that are more resilient to that, and the US is and Canada are not not in that on that list, because we've promoted such a independence and such a sense, which and promoted a sense of isolation, especially since COVID. It's been even worse, but it's just provide promoting this, like, this attitude of I can do it, and just me. So
Yeah, yeah,
and
you're right to highlight other
can't
cultures.
we
Yeah,
can't. We have to. We need each other. We need each other, and that is part of the definition of. Let's see. We don't want to call you don't want to call it mental health anymore, but I'm trying to think of another term. Like inner health, inner resilience.
well, it's the
Hey,
health.
there we
It's the
go.
health. The problem with the health term, right, is that it's been so medicalized now. That's why I don't like it, right? Because it's sort of like we can still say the economic health of the nation, and people understand that you don't mean literally doctors should be in charge of the economic decisions at the national level, right? We know that, but in this space, it's often forgotten, right? That it's just a metaphor to say mental health. That we were referring to just something like what does it mean to be able to feel like you're vital and able to get through your day, and that when you're going through your ups and downs that there are still opportunities and possibilities, whatever we mean by that, and I
Right,
think this is part of our problem is we have a narrowing vision of even what it means to be a quote unquote, healthy person, or just a
right,
you know
right. Yeah,
like
and
it's called
that's
now, but
yeah,
yeah.
and that's the stigma too, is like where we want to label somebody with a mental health issue versus somebody that doesn't. And but in reality, it is permeated throughout our throughout our social structures. And this the spectrum, a range of challenges, emotional and mental challenges, because it's called being human. And what happens is, if we don't have the systems in place, meaning the social system, the resilient family system, friends, purpose in life, good food, place to live, all these things are so essential to our, they're not thought of as essential to our mental health, but they are absolutely essential to our mental health. We don't, like, for example, many homeless people that are called having a mental health problem, as you pointed out earlier, actually, many of them didn't have that to begin with until they became homeless. Or they might have had just a little problem. It was just a momentary glitch in their life. And then suddenly they have this full blown mental health problem because they're homeless, And it just exacerbates. So, so how we live, how we take care of ourselves, our self-care, um, and how we connect with other people, all of that, as well as our choices and how we practice our practices that can provide a lot of healing for our inner health, our inner resilience, as we call it. So all of those things conspire to make what we might consider a mentally, emotionally healthy person, if they have all those things in place. But it can happen to any one of us where something gets thrown off. And then if we don't have the right response, or don't have a way to deal with it in the moment, and it can happen to any of us. So it's like, we all need to stay humble around this subject,
Yeah, well,
because it's like it's and then we have this wider landscape of climate change, and of the wars, and so many of my friends are just really having real despair issues in their life, which are creating anxiety, creating depression. These are real issues as a result of what's going on in the world.
yeah, and I think we're seeing in this, space that we're in now, a sort of an opportunity, because it could go either way, and that's one of my concerns. So, yeah, we see people just with climate change alone, especially young people, right, can have such deep distress and concern and anxiety. It can be so profound, And we have this opportunity right now, and we got to be careful because, as I discuss in the book, there's a movement out there to pathologize that, to say this is it. You have catastrophic thinking, and you have you're slipping into depression, and we must drug you, we must give you therapy to solve this. But we've pathologized that. But in fact, what I think you and I share is an understanding that, wait a minute here, this is also really important and valuable. And we're not saying, oh, we're encouraging people to be completely debilitated. But on the other hand, we are saying, hey, yeah, you need to experience that. You need to open up and recognize that there is a real threat to humanity, and that boils right down also to the individual level. And we're all involved in this. And so you need to feel that and experience it. And then, okay, what does it mean to move through that? Because that could be actually a really positive fuel to understand the depth of the challenge we're facing and realize it requires transformation. And this is, other cultures get this better than our own gets this. And historically it was understood better that often some of these really negative feelings we have can fuel spiritual transformation, political transformation. And that's what I think we're trying to make sure that all of that this moment in time is understood for its opportunity for us to start talking about what does meaningful social change mean, and what does meaningful inner change mean, not by pathologizing ourselves, not by saying you're either healthy or you're unhealthy, but rather, on any given day, in any given moment, you can be struggling more or not struggling more. And what you're learning along the way is what's important, and what you're creatively developing as possible solutions for this approach. That's really important.
Yeah, that's so important. Being creatively engaged is definitely one of the things on the list of what is important for our well-being, for being mentally and emotionally resilient. And I know at the Inner Resilience Network, we've been particularly interested in finding what are what are practices and tools that we can do for maintaining an ongoing inner life that reflects in our outer life, that shows up in our outer life, that is very tangible and real. It's not just going off and sitting on the mountain somewhere, um, but really engaging in relationships and in your community in a way that is healthy, that brings health, to you and to your community. So to me, that is mental and emotional health. That is inner resilience. It's not just me, sitting in my corner. So, and I really feel like that's the direction we need to be going as a society, is to be thinking of mental health in this way, that it is relational, it is interconnected. And it is also a big piece of it is how much we need to make it part of our relationship with the earth, and can reconnect to the earth and to nature, because that has right there. I mean, we could have a whole discussion on how much that has fragmented our minds. And I also just want to, say one thing more about trauma, because eh, you know, we're going to have a whole show on trauma another time, but because it's a very important subject. But this is definitely an important element in what you've been finding and everything you're talking about, and how much, and also what we're seeing in the world, with the wars and corporations and environmental degradation, all the things that we've been talking about forever and we're very aware of, is all very much involved in the what I call the trauma field of the planet. And so being aware that we're in this field, we're in this soup of trauma, and that, if we can make ourselves healthy and our families healthy and our communities healthy, and just kind of work from the bottom up to metabolize the trauma that is of the field that we're in. I really think that's the way we're going to save the world. So if we do so, but not from a top down, this old notion, this old paradigm notion of like the World Health Organization saying, okay, we are defining what mental health is, and we're going to control it, and we're going to, tell you what is and what isn't, and all these things, right? And that doesn't work. Obviously, look at where we are. So
Yeah.
we got to do it this other way, I think.
Yeah, we share that interest in the transition town movement, in part because that's what it's done and is still working at doing is creating really practical solutions, trying to bring diverse stakeholders and communities to the same table, seek out common ground, and look at really practical ways to move forward on some of these really large scale problems that we're facing. And that sort of grassroots, community-based, volunteer-based approaches can be tremendous. And specifically on the emotional sort of side of that, one of the things, there's an intervention that's becoming better known called open dialogue, which was developed as an intervention for people in a crisis, emotional crisis situation, to try to prevent them from being forcibly hospitalized and forcibly drugged, tranquilized. And so this method involves bringing a person's entire network into the same room, and all conversations happening out in the open. So nothing happens behind closed doors. And so they'll ask the person who's kind of becoming the target of the system, if you will, they'll say to them, okay, who would you like at these meetings? And so they'll identify their family members and friends and work colleagues that they would like. And so these people hopefully agree and they attend. And then everybody talks about their shared stress. So it's no longer about just that person. It's that person in some ways regarded as a manifestation of the community stress. And so people will, and they'll also own that. They'll say, okay, whatever you're going through is frightening me. I'm seeing you go through something that's frightening to me, and then I worry, and then I want to call like emergency services or the police or whatever, and so then that person hears that and says, okay, and so they work out compromises together. What can we both do to help each other? Because sometimes it's also, well, the thing you're doing is what's driving me into this state. If only you would react differently, right? Then I might be more calm when I'm getting into my stress state. And I use that then as an example, a metaphor for what we can all be doing in our
Yeah.
communities and with our friends and our work associates, right? Without having to get to that point where somebody's, at risk of being locked up, right? But hopefully earlier, where we are just talking and we're sharing, like, okay, here's how we're influencing each other. Here's how we're interacting. What are the ways in our community in which some people are being driven to a brink where they're probably going to end up in crisis when they have such extreme poverty or some sort of trauma that they've been through, which is welling up for them in certain circumstances? How can we then accommodate them better? And how can they also hear our stresses and how we're reacting and maybe help us, work with them and collaborate with them? And I think that's
Yeah.
obviously not a prescriptive solution in any one instance. You have to work it out with your own community, right?
You're reminding me of a framework. These are cultural frameworks too, because in our culture and our westernized mindset, we do focus on, and that's where that pathologizing comes from. We focus on the person as the problem. And in other cultures, and I can't remember which, I've actually just recently read this, and I'm trying to remember what the culture was that it was referring to as Eastern, where they don't focus on the person of this problem. If there's a problem happening, they look at all the components of what is involved. The environment, the family, what that person ate, all kinds of things that are involved, everything. So it's an interconnected issue. It's not about this one person being a problem. And I love that. And I know that there's like in many indigenous cultures, they support, a different way of approaching mental health. I mean, I really love, like having been around people that were having a lot of challenges in an indigenous environment and seeing how they were being supported and being held and just accepted and not being pathologized, not being stigmatized, not being sent off somewhere, but just being embraced, is like they are just dealing with something. They're just dealing with what they're dealing with, it's just, there's such a beautiful, grounded, loving kindness to this way of holding people that we consider to be, having a problem. And I think that it's made the problems worse. Of course, you've got the extreme of mental health problems where you get somebody violent and shooting people, and we've unfortunately see way too much of that. But I think that's a symptom of them not getting this kind of help early on. And so how do we shift our Well, really, what I'm saying is, how do we shift our culture? How do we make a culture that's caring, that we step outside of othering each other and make it this system? I think that's what we have to do, right?
Yeah, well, one of the things we're up against is that this kind of this individualizing approach that a lot of mainstream psychology and psychiatry takes on right now, it has become popularized in part, and it's received more funding in part because it really does feed the attitude and the needs of a capitalistic individualistic approach that our society is already kind of heavily embedded in, right? So now we can look at homeless people and essentially gives us a tool to blame homeless people for being homeless, right? It's like, oh, it's because they're crazy. That's why they're homeless, even though all the data shows actually, if any, that's a tiny percentage. And even for that tiny percentage, is that really, as you point out, homelessness exacerbates anybody's mental health situation so severely anyway. It'd be hard to even parse that out, right? But more importantly, just highlighting that it's given, like, it's clearly there's so many economic factors and affordability factors and livable income and work opportunity factors that have come into why we're seeing rising homelessness, but it really fuels certain attitudes that legislators want to have, politicians want to have, that a lot of people in our culture want to have, of saying, no, 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 I don't have to bear any responsibility for that. We don't have to change anything. Those people are the problem. So that's kind of what we're up against right now, is that it's a very strong tendency that's getting constantly reinforced in our culture. And I think the word you used of, no, let's understand these problems as relational. That's a great word to talk about, right? Exactly. Like, that homeless person is not homeless because they live in isolation. No, if they lived in isolation, guess what? They'd be like a First Nations person, an Indigenous person who had access to all the land they needed, right, to survive freely. And that's been taken away from, and not only taken away from them, it's been taken away from all of us. There were points in my life where I would have loved nothing better than to just had free access to land that I could have roamed on and lived on safely, and learned from other people who might have been living out there how to survive on my own. I would have loved that. That would have been an amazingly healing and learning journey for me, right? But so it was taken away from me as well, right? It was taken away. It's been taken away from all of us, that kind of freedom. And so
Yeah.
that's something that we
Yeah.
need to get back. And it's fundamentally relational. It's fundamentally about nature, access to nature in a relational way, not just visiting it on a weekend in a park, right? But
Yeah.
what is it, and how do we rebuild that? And I think we have to build it person by person and relationship by relationship, right?
Right. Doing what you and I are doing, and having these conversations, and small steps, moments, because one of the things that I see is also happening is people, is more and more people in our circles that are aware of, well, there's a range, again, from people that believe that there's imminent collapse to those that still are working on mitigation. So, and everything in between. So, but you can easily get into the overwhelmingness of the problems of the world, and and then what happens is we go into trauma response, and because we're dealing with, we're focusing on something that we literally cannot do anything about. And it creates this tension in us, this inner conflict, this cognitive dissonance that we cannot do anything about. And so we just shut down and turn off and go into trauma, which is trauma response, right? So it's important to know what's going on in the world. I'm not saying turn a blind eye, but then come back to what's right in front of us. What can we do something about with each other? How do we, little things matter. Little things are big things. Getting outside for an hour and sitting on the ground and laying on the ground, or listening to the birds. Meditating is a big one for me. I absolutely feel like that's essential, but there's so many other ways of getting your care in, and building relationships with people that you care about, and investing in our relationships Relationships are not a byproduct. They are they are the core of life, you know, how we are with each other. So
Mhm.
that little things, and I feel like if we're all doing that, it will make a difference. We will shift this huge ship, or not. We could end up being like Margaret Wheatley says, um, hubs of sanity in a sea of chaos. So that could happen too. But I'm all for making a hub of sanity, and I know you are too. And you're doing great work up there in Canada with your resilient neighborhoods. You want to say just a plug for that a little bit? I know you mentioned it, but maybe there's a little bit more before we wrap up this talk.
Yeah, yeah, there were a few things in what you're saying that I sort of, wanted to respond to from that
Sure.
perspective. Like, I do think that we can build these things, from the ground up. And one thing I really miss is that when I began working in sort of political spaces, grassroots community work, uh, decades ago, it was far more common at that time because it was basically pre-internet to do work in communities, right? That even if I wanted to, I was an anti-nuclear activist at one point, well, I did that in my community, right? There was no way I could get on a national platform instantly in that sense, or anything pretense of a national platform. So it was like I'd get together and we might, bring in a movie or a show or have a talk, and that happened in that community. And we invited people who were in that community. And so my point is just like, as we were doing the activism, we were also developing friendships. We were having little parties. We were going for walks together. There were all these things that would kind of touch different aspects of your being in different ways, even as you were engaging with that political action, right? Because you were with people, and I really miss that. And I do think that's an important
Yes.
part of this.
Yeah.
And that, of course, is part of the transition town model, right? Is working at your local community level. And so I do think it's amazing what we can access now, that people like you and I can collaborate in different ways and get to know each other across these spaces. But there's a great pain there, I think, that we're all feeling, whether we know it or not, whether we see it or not. And that is the pain of community connection. And so, yeah, one of the things I'm also doing painfully right now, a little bit from a distance as well, because I've moved to be with closer to my father. But in a couple of cities, I'm still involved in neighbor to neighbor connection building, and this is what we find. Like, and again, the more impoverished people are, or the more other struggles that they're dealing with in their lives, you often find that the isolation is higher, and the pain, and they know it. They know the isolation they're experiencing. And so often one of the most rewarding things to witness is just seeing that, to the degree we helped bring a group together in a building or in a neighborhood who'd not been together before, often amazing things happen spontaneously as a result of them getting to know each other and just sharing a bit. And something like, oh, you have that problem too? Well, wait a minute. I've actually worked on that. I have a solution. And they're just, things are happening that you just did not envision, you did not plan for or control for. And so I do think we just need far more of that going on again. It used to be more common. It's become less so. And yeah, that, I think that could do wonders for people, for their emotional connections, as well as their practical efforts to bring about change. And I think in the end, the politicians will follow, because right now they aren't leading us well at all. I don't think they're going to. I don't think we can rely on them. I think we need to, just more and more people need to get involved truly in recreate democracy again from the ground up. We need it. We've lost democracy largely too. And so recreate that, what it means to be a fully engaged citizen in your community, engage with others. And then as we do that, politicians are going to take notice as those movements grow and start to go, oh, okay, how can we facilitate that? How can we help you? Because they're going to be wanting to be part of that movement as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And hopefully the ones that um try to co-opt it, because there is that too. So we're we'll keep navigating, but I think it's really safe to safe to keep coming back to ground zero, which is nature and each other, and then our inner practices, our inner self-care practices. I don't think any of this works without some kind of self-care practice of some sort, because we are ground zero. Each of us is ground zero. So starting at ground zero, and then being in our communities in a healthy way, it just keeps coming back to this. Simple, right? It's not rocket science. It's not, we don't need a lot of newfangled technology to figure it out. We just need to remember what is in our bones, and bring it alive, and feed it, but I am concerned about our children right now, being so disconnected because of this, isolated and disconnected, and losing that social health, and the relational health. And so again, I come back to myself. Let's just be a model, keep talking about it. I hope that, spread seeds, keep doing the work, and I just appreciate you so much for everything you're doing. All of this, it's not easy what you've done to expose this. It's very dark, but it's the only way we can bring light to the dark is to expose it, is to show it, is to talk about it. And so that's very important what you're doing. And I just really want to acknowledge you in your work. So thank you so, so, so much. And we'll continue this conversation in another on another related topic, I'm sure. But any
All
last
right.
words you'd like to say?
No, just thank you. It's been a great conversation. I appreciate it and appreciate you. So thank you.
Yeah. All right. Be well, everybody out there. Take good care of yourselves. We love you.